What's up, geeks and gamers? It's Odin coming back with a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which continues to see The Flash falling off a cliff with one of the biggest drop-offs in the entire history of the DCEU. Not the worst drop-off that we have ever seen in the box office history. Again, but still dropping domestically from week 1 to week 2 over 70%. Definitely not a good sign. There is some good news, however, for Disney when it comes to Elemental, because it actually had a pretty strong hold from week 1 to week 2. The big problem, of course, and this is something that many in the mainstream media that might be trying to spin it as a positive, as a huge plus for Disney, the one tiny little thing they forget to mention is, wait a minute, that's just based off of the opening weekend numbers, which, remember, were historic lows for that company, or historic lows for Disney Pixar. So even if you have some of the strongest holds in the world, the fact that you had such a small amount of money to go off of, it doesn't matter how strong your holds are. We just know, because of the law of diminishing returns, because of the way the box office works with having drops every single week, that it's not going to be able to, even if it has these kinds of holds all the way until the end of time, as far as its box office life is concerned, it's not going to have enough to be able to push it over the edge. Some people, of course, like here over at Nancy over at Deadline, our good friend Nance, is trying to talk about how Little Mermaid's nearing $500 million. Okay, it's doing well, guys. You said it wouldn't even hit $500 million, and so now it is. Yeah, the film still needs to make a lot more to break even, and that's just not going to happen. So you got a $100+ million flop coming out of The Little Mermaid with Elemental and with The Flash. Conservatively combined, $300 million loss, all combined, and that's a conservative estimate. Many are speculating that The Flash itself could lose upwards of $300 million for Warner Brothers when all is said and done, with Elemental losing upwards of $150 to $200 million. We'll break down the numbers, though, and try to talk about and make sense of why it is you're seeing some of the different metrics being used in this way. So first, starting off, as you can see, Deadline's trying to talk about how Elemental is showing some sparks overseas. It's doing better, guys. And I think a lot of that's also stemming from the fact that they see, hey, the week 2 drop-off, only 38%. That is a strong hold. And guess what? For a movie, as a percentage, that is a very strong hold. Here's the big problem, though. Look at that per theater ratio. That per theater ratio shows you that, yes, the hold was strong, but the beginning was not all that big in the first place. Again, this movie opened up in the, $29 million in its 3-day opening weekend, a little over $30 million when you add in the holiday for Juneteenth. So you're looking at a film that domestically, so far, after 2 weeks, has made $65 million. That is not a very good number, especially when you put that next to a film like The Flash, also been out for 2 weeks, which has only made about $87 million. And so even though The Flash had a much bigger drop-off because its opening weekend was that much higher than what Elemental's was, you're having both films be kind of in the same boat, with Flash actually doing a little bit better because of possibly having more screens. They have actually added 22 screens, which is kind of bizarre to me. Warner Brothers, what in the heck are you thinking with this movie? I'm surprised that you actually honestly released this film with how poorly this film is actually doing. Again, a 72% drop from week 1 to week 2. That is absolutely abysmal. And you all know that here on Geeks and Gamers, over at OMB Reviews as well, that week 2 drop-off is always especially key because we get our most accurate projections on what a film will likely make by the end of its run in total box office, and then we can speculate as far as actual net gains and profits are concerned. The only new release that we had this week was No Hard Feelings, the movie that everyone was waiting for with Jennifer Lawrence. That film only opened up to $15.1 million, so a brand new release coming at the number 4 spot, and this film cost $45 million to make. There's actually a chance that this film also doesn't make all that much money, and hey, who would have thought that Jennifer Lawrence wouldn't bring a lot of people to go see a movie? Maybe it's because movies actually have to be good these days. Maybe because star power doesn't mean a whole lot. And maybe it's because her star power isn't nearly as powerful as it once was when she started to open her mouth and talk about political stupid things. But hey, what would I know? I'm just a dude talking to a camera. Round of the top 5 is Transformers Rise of the Beast, which, even though the numbers themselves are definitely probably better than what some people had expected, it is still on its pathway to being a massive flop. Looking at the overall box office, as you can see, though, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, this is probably the most impressive of it all, to be perfectly honest, because this movie has been out for 4 weeks, and yet it came in at the number 1 spot. I said that there was a good chance of this film once again taking that number 1 spot, especially when the projections were coming in for the weekend, and sure enough, it was able to do so. So you have Spider-Verse doing much better, Elemental coming in above The Flash, again, an completely unknown property. in Elemental actually doing better in its second weekend, I think this spells a lot of trouble for The Flash in the long run. The Spider-Verse at $560 million, I've said from the beginning, once those opening weekend numbers came out, this film is bound to make over $600 million at this point. Has been for quite a while. The big question is how much more and how much over $600 million. Right now, it seems like it's pacing to be somewhere between $650 and $750 when all is said and done, which for a movie that only costs $100 million, is pretty darn good. Elemental, not nearly in the same position. Again, some are going to say, oh, but that drop was so strong. Yeah, but these numbers after 2 weeks are low. I mean, the entire total of the entire 2 weeks internationally, worldwide, for this movie is about the same amount of money as Little Mermaid did in its opening weekend worldwide. In fact, Little Mermaid made a lot more worldwide than the entirety of Elementals. In fact, this is probably closer to the total domestic opening weekend for Little Mermaid. So I think that it, again, is showing just how much of a bad position the Disney Pixar franchise and the Disney Pixar IP is at this point in time, right? They are not a very strong position. And if they've got other films set to come out this year, I think Wish, there's a film called Wish, I believe, coming from them sometime either this year or next year. I forget if that's Disney Pixar, if that's Disney Animation. In either case, I would not be surprised if it has a very similar fate to this. Then we also have The Flash. Now, this is probably one of the biggest stories going on right now. Shout out to Valiant Renegade, because I know that he just got recently picked up by a mainstream outlet. I believe he got picked up by Breitbart News for his coverage of how much money Hollywood is losing, how much money especially companies like Disney are losing. I think the one thing that many people are forgetting, though, is Disney's losing a lot of money. There's no doubt about it. Warner Brothers is losing possibly even more money. I mean, if you look at The Flash alone, this movie, some are projecting it to lose upwards of $300 million. Now, I tend to use what is now seen today as a much more conservative estimate, a much more conservative charting. However, I do still think it's important nonetheless to talk about how the range for this movie is not good. Whether it loses $150 million, whether it loses $300 million, in either case, it is a massive flop and a massive loss for Disney. No hard feelings. Yeah, no hard feelings. Don't care about this movie whatsoever, Jennifer Lawrence. J-Law. Go back to making indies that you actually had some promise and potential in your acting career before going off the rails. Rise of the Beast, also $341 million. Again, not terrible when you look at the opening numbers for it, but definitely not all that great either. Updates on Little Mermaid, now at $499 million worldwide. Again, this film probably won't make that much higher than $500 million now at this point in time. Guardians at $826. This film at another $6 million or so since last weekend worldwide, so this film does still have a chance of getting to $850. It would basically have to be pretty consistent from this point out. 2 weeks ago, it was another $10 million. Last week, it was another $6 million, or rather, this week was another $6 million. So if it keeps on having those incremental losses, you could still just see this film end up between $840 and $850 when all is said and done. I would personally really like to see this film beat out a movie like Wakanda Forever, but it's kind of it's at this point, only the numbers and only the next weeks will be able to tell. There's no way of really predicting that at this point in time. Going into the box office charting, though, because I know that's what we love to do here on OMB Reviews and also over at Geeks and Gamers. We are live on Geeks and Gamers right now, or at least I'm recording this live. We like to do things live here. But as you can see, with $210 million for The Flash, I'm sure this is what a lot of people are kind of wondering about. So even though your break-even point might be very different than mine, this one metric I have been using now for years has proven itself to be pretty effective, proven itself to be pretty accurate, and that is, what is the entirety of the box office for these films going to end up being? After 2 weeks, we can make some pretty good guesses. Most films, the vast majority of films, fall somewhere between this range. So most movies will either double their first 2 weeks, if they're very successful. So films like Top Gun Maverick, for instance, more than doubled its first 2 weeks, whereas other films that are not very good will make about maybe 70 to 75% of their entire box office in their first 2 weeks. So let's say worst case scenario, right, with a 70% drop in the domestic market and I think a 58% drop internationally, so pretty massive drops overall for The Flash. If we see those wheels continue to fall off, the film will only get to $300 million worldwide. If it's able to double its first 2 weeks, which based on those first drops that we're seeing is not likely going to happen, it would only get to $421 million. Now, the number that they have given us, the studio has given us, is $200 to $220 million. That would make it a break even of roughly $550, meaning the film is going to lose probably around $150 to well over $100 million. Now, again, this is where there's going to be some disagreements. I know that channels like Valiant Renegade, and I know that Ryan also of RK Outpost uses a little bit of a different multiplier. They typically use a 3 times the budget multiplier. But even in that case, and especially when you take into account, there are reports that the budget for this film was well over $220 million. And based on what I've seen, it seems that is likely the case. That means this movie could potentially lose, and let's just put it this way. Right now, I would say the minimum this film loses, based on the numbers and how we're seeing the tracking happening, the minimum it loses is 150, with the maximum being somewhere around or over $300 million. Now, we've seen some pretty big financial losses over the past few years, especially with COVID. A $300 million loss for this movie and for this studio would possibly be one of the worst performing films in the entire history of not only the DCEU, but also of the entirety of the box office and the entirety of the history of Warner Brothers. I mean, we're talking catastrophic numbers. And if we don't see some changes start to happen soon at studios like Warner Brothers and studios like Disney, like actual real substantial changes, guess what? All your stockholders, you should probably start to take note, because you're going to start to lose a crap ton of money, because guess what? Movies are a huge portion of where money comes from when it comes to these giant corporations, these massive corporations. And when you're losing hundreds of millions of dollars every single year on projects that no one wants to see, eventually it takes its toll. But those are the numbers as they stand. If you want a full box office breakdown, Joe, check me out over at OMB Reviews. That video will probably already be up by the time this video goes live. But let me know your thoughts about this and anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. For this video, smash that like button. Whatever it is that you're watching, make sure you smash it. And just a quick note, you could actually potentially see, again, depending on budgets here, Elemental, because it's doing that much worse. Yeah, you're looking at this movie being between 150 to 200 million, which means if you take into account other standards, you could see actually both movies be $250+ million losses for each company. I mean, insane numbers here. But anyway, you guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.